name is Jenny Irwin, and I am the director of our Coalition for a Safe and Drug-Free Cherokee County out of North Carolina. I want to say hi to everyone.
Hi, my name's Amy Haskins. I am the director of the Jackson County Anti-Drug Coalition in West Virginia. I'm also the administrator of our local health department here in Jackson County. So today we are going to talk about the good, the bad, and the ugly of policy work. Jenny and I'm sure that you all have both had experiences with policy work so far. And Jenny and I will tell you that there are certainly some things that we get excited about and some things that are very frustrating. So let's see if we can move these forward. All right, Nick. Can't move it forward. Jenny? Because it says I have control, but it's not letting me control. Oh, there we go.
There it goes.
Okay, so policy work does not have to be a painful experience. Policy work is certainly a challenge. It takes lots of due diligence on the part of either the committee or the coalition as a whole that's trying to work on the various policies that you're working on. And it's not something, most policies are not anything that will happen overnight. It's something that might take weeks or, in our case, years to see the passage of certain policies or ordinances. And you certainly need to expect some backlash with various policies that you are either looking at passing or have passed, because let's face it, not everybody agrees, and that's what makes the world go round. So you will have certainly your supporters, but you're also going to have a fair share of backlash.
So I found policy work to be daunting and pretty painful at times. However, the following 3 items we have listed made it actually less painful for I know on my part in the policy work. The data's hard to argue with. When you have data on your side, it's hard for people to argue with why you might need policy. Every community is unique, and your problems are very specific to your community. So gathering that data to tell your story on why you need that policy helps to identify those policies that might be helpful to your community. Community support and concerns. The biggest thing that I learned was if your community, no matter how much you need that policy, if your community is not ready to tackle that substance abuse problem or that policy, it's not going to work. You're going to have a hard time making that change and creating any policy around that issue, even if you know that community needs it. The biggest thing is finding out what your community concerns are regarding, especially around youth substance use. Are they concerned or angry about the use in local parks? Are they concerned over parents hosting? Once you find out that the community, what they're concerned about, what makes them angry, then you'll be able to move forward with identifying what policies that you'll be successful or at least have community support around. And I hate to encourage being an ambulance chaser, but when there's a tragedy in your community, that's when your community becomes passionate. That's when your community says, we need to do something. And that's when you need to really jump in and start the talk about what we can do, changing policy, putting environmental strategies in place. Even though it might be hard to bring that subject up, that's the key moment. Relationships, those go hand in hand with the community concerns. Now, creating relationships, I know they talk a lot about creating relationships with your leaders, and that is true, but your leaders are a lot of times voted in, and they want to know that policies are supported by the community because they're going to probably run for re-election. And if they know that they have community support around maybe even a controversial policy that you know needs to be put in place, they're more apt to get on your side and provide that's community support. So relationships are really key, not only with key leaders, but people in your community that can make it happen. So those that are really involved in your community, the ones that like to talk a lot, like to go to the coffee shops and have conversations with groups of people, ones that are involved in a lot of community going on.
And if I could just add, Jenny, it doesn't necessarily have to be a formal relationship in the format of a MOU or a work plan and all of that kinds of things. There's a lot of policies that Jenny and I have both worked on in our communities that have happened over, the fruit section of the grocery store or in the middle of the ballpark watching our kids play. I mean, those are conversations that we have. And you need to be able to have those relationships where you can have those conversations anywhere in your community versus outside of a formal meeting. And I think that's important because that shows the comfort level that they have with you and with your coalition.
And in those informal conversations, they're actually more apt to be brutally honest with you. They're more apt to talk about things that they're not going to talk about in a huge meeting, maybe even some personal things that go on. So those relationships are very important, those informal relationships.
Okay, so just working with Deacon and going through CADCA and things, you all know that there's small P's and there's big P's. Some of the small P's might be more informal, perhaps verbal agreements. They would be quick wins, things that you can get done fairly quickly for the most part. That doesn't take a lot of effort, that it's kind of there on the verge of happening anyway. Big P's would be something that would be more formal. It certainly takes time, and you want it to be documented specifically. Usually requires some type of vote for a passage, whether that's or state or local legislators, by a Board of Education, something like that. And it may take longer to see results. There are some big P's that we have been working on for about 5 years in our coalition. And some of our smaller P's we have been working on for a long time, but most of our smaller P's have been the quicker wins that we were able to garner in support of our efforts. Do you have anything to add to that, Jenny?
Just in terms of the big P's, just being patient. And we'll talk a little bit more about that when we get into the examples. So when we talk about examples of small policies, as you can see, Amy and I have listed some of the policies that we think are small policies. Just a couple under mine, like the second one. How that one happened, that was the business agreed to post no vaping signs. So currently there's no regulations in stores or restaurants. And it just so happened we were sitting in a restaurant and my son noticed that he said, "Mom, someone's smoking." And so I turned around and it was actually the entertainment was vaping. And so we kindly asked the server if they allowed vaping. And they said they were pretty surprised about us asking because they hadn't even thought about that. So they hadn't even thought about putting up no vaping or asking the person not to vape. So that was a pretty informal, where we then met with them with a bunch of students and they agreed to post no vaping signs. It was a pretty easy, quick fix to a problem that my son noticed. So small policies can take place in no time at all. It didn't take very long to get the no vaping signs. And once one business began posting them, other businesses were quick to follow along. I know in the middle school, I saw that many of you are working on on school policies. The fourth one down, the middle school policy, that verbal policy to require and for detention for violation of tobacco policy, that was just a conversation I had with our principal because the consequences weren't really doing anything. And so having that parent meeting, that parent piece that was missing, that this was a policy that where just a conversation with the principal about how can we get parents involved. This was a parent involvement encouragement policy. So the small policies they don't have to be, they don't even have to look pretty. They don't have to be in writing. It could just be a verbal conversation between you and whoever is able to make that decision.
And some of our smaller policies, they are written policies. They have been voted on by city councils. Like if you look down my list, you'll see no tobacco use on any city park property in both of the cities that we have within our county. And that was actually an ordinance that was put into place after our youth coalition members did cigarette butt pickups. And we took all of the cigarette butts to the city council meetings and said, you know, you need to look and see what we are dealing with within our communities. And it was a side conversation that I had with one of the mayors at a July celebration, actually, talking about whether or not this would be a possible ordinance to be passed within the city. And the fact that our kids had presented information on it probably a year ago prior to him being elected to office. And he absolutely jumped at the chance, did not want the kids to come back, asked the kids if they wanted to come back and present, but it wasn't a mandatory thing for them to do so. And within 3 weeks, we had a city ordinance saying that there was going to be no smoking, no e-cigarettes, no vaping, no tobacco use at all in our city parks. So, you know, it's finding that right time. We did the same thing with the beer garden ordinance. That was a conversation that started, I think, in a parking lot with the same city mayor. And we were talking about how they were going to start offering alcohol at one of their fairs and festivals that they have within that city. And that has never been done in this county before. And, you know, I just had a conversation with him and said, with best practices, these are the ways that you reduce youth substance abuse, particularly with underage drinking. It did not take him 5 minutes. It was, I got sample ordinances from 3 other states. He picked the one that he liked, had his lawyer look at it, and it was done in 3 months' time because that was something that he felt was important. So again, those relationships are very, very important.
The one thing, they can happen very quickly, but like Amy had said before, they might take a little bit of time even though they're small policies. The third one on my list under Jenny, created and implemented the no smoking on government steps. That was a labor of love. One of our commissioners, she had asthma, and there was conversation. We'd have conversation at meetings about how we hated when on court day, individuals would go outside and they'd stand right beside the door and smoke. And one of the law enforcement officer that was inside would complain about how every time the door would open, smoke would roll in. And so she would complain about how she didn't like people smoking on the steps. So one of the commissioners and the coalition decided, well, let's get the no smoking on government steps. Let's move it off at least the steps away from the door. Well, you would think that would be a no-brainer. It would be done and over in a matter of a day. But we had to convince some other local leaders that it was not a right to smoke right next to the door. For some reason, that they wanted to protect everybody's rights to smoke, but could not see how it was detrimental to people walking in the door. So it actually took us about 2 years to get that policy, just a sign saying no smoking on government steps. So it took us 2 years just because of the relationship and that was created with the commissioner. But we had to talk really about getting community support. We had to do a survey with community members. We had to do a survey with the government employees about how much they wanted to get the smoking off the steps. So it took about 2 years to get that little policy passed. Okay, so here are some examples of large policies. I know on my side, all of these absolutely required data to get them even on the discussion table. The first one, in regards to created and implemented a random drug testing for student drivers, that took me over 5 years, the coalition for over 5 years to get it finally to the subcommittee and put in place. One reason is we needed to wait for some new administration, and again, that was the relationships and the community concerns. But the data absolutely drove that one. Our data talked about how we have a lot of students coming to school that admitted smoking marijuana before school, and that includes drivers. So taking that data and moving forward with other data, student survey, we did private survey groups with the youth. We did a community survey to show that they were in support of this, because they surely didn't want, the school board did not want backlash from community. They wanted the community support. They wanted to know that the community was not going to have an issue with this. So we had to get a lot of data, and it took over 5 years. The second one, this is the one we're currently advocating for, a needle exchange program. Right now, it's going to take a long time because of the first thing we have to do is we have to educate, and educating the leaders, the ones that can make those decisions. And that, because right now they don't see, we have a high Hep C rate in our area. And the first thing we're doing is we're starting to create concern, because this is a Hep C, we are a high Hep C. They actually, we're in the top 5 of the state, but a lot of people don't know that. So we have to educate the leaders and the public about what this really means, why we are looking at possibly needing a needle exchange program. So there's a lot of work that we have ahead of us in regards to if we ever are going to see something like this come into our community. But these large policies, they take time. They take, you take one step forward, you take 25 back. You reevaluate, you take one step forward, you take 25 back. So it's not giving up.
And I can tell you with our large policies, the very first one that's on our list is the K2 synthetics bill that was passed for the state of West Virginia. And that was in our very first year of having a DFC grant, so 8 years ago. And we were, I will say, lucky in the fact that we had a huge synthetics issue. And we approached our state senator about looking at sample bills from other states and looking at what worked from those bills and what didn't work for those bills. And we started that process during the summer so that the bill was ready to go and ready to be introduced by October when they went into session. And so as a year 1 DFC grantee, we were able to get a synthetics bill passed for the state of West Virginia, which is a huge accomplishment. And it literally took maybe a 4-month time period. And you don't see that happen very often, especially for state legislation. It usually takes much, much longer than that. I think the average is you introduce a bill 3 or 4 times before it ever makes it out of committee. So usually it takes much longer. You know, we have asked for the last 5 years, we have advocated for an increase in alcohol taxes. The state of West Virginia increases tobacco tax every year, whether it's 50 cents or $3, they will do a tobacco tax every year. And so we have tried to get our legislators to understand that, and we have always seen a decrease in youth tobacco use. And we have tried to get them to understand that if you do the same thing for alcohol, you will see a decrease in underage drinking. And nobody wants to talk about the underage drinking issue in West Virginia. So that's why we were talking about with data. It is so important that you have the data to back you up, because I can show my legislators that we have a major underage drinking problem in our county that nobody wants to talk about. And if you look at statewide data, we have a huge underage drinking problem. But again, nobody wants to talk about it. So that has been something that we've worked on for 5 years. We have not given it up. We're still working on it. And this year in our legislature, if the governor signs it, they pass to have a increase on the barrel tax for beer. Not necessarily an all across the board, but just a barrel tax increase. So we'll see what happens there. One of the other larger things that our coalition worked on for a number of years is medicinal marijuana issue. And West Virginia, up until this year, they have always introduced it and it has always died in committee. This year, it was introduced in the Senate, passed the Senate, was transferred to the House, failed. The Senate bill failed the House. So I was reading the Senate bill actually on the way to take my kids to the movies on a Friday night. And during the movies, I was texting my delegate, telling them what was wrong with that medicinal marijuana bill. And if it was going to pass this year for West Virginia, this is what needed to be included. These were some of the best practices. And when I got the House bill, that's exactly what was in there. There were some things that still were a little bit more lenient, but we were happy that a lot of the things that we advocated for were included in that. And that was probably 5 or 6 years in the making. Also having the creation of statewide policies for regional incinerators. We purchased our own incinerator in, I believe it was year 3 of our DFC grant. And we worked for the last 5 years to get incinerators placed regionally throughout the state. And we worked with our Department of Environmental Protection to get policies established so that the state police could utilize incinerators, so that local coalitions could utilize incinerators. We have done a lot of things. Our coalition focuses a lot on large, broad-scale policies that can make a difference, not only for our community, but for the state of West Virginia. We feel like that's important because of the issues and the crisis that we are facing with opioids and heroin and meth. So we try to really focus on things that are going to make a larger difference in the state versus just our community as a whole. Ready to talk about failures, Jenny?
Well, I did want to mention one thing is that when you are looking at developing these large policies, and the biggest thing is I recommend getting together a planning policy committee that has youth on board, not your whole coalition, but actually just a smaller committee to work on these policies. Because we as prevention and coalition members, they hear us all the time. We're always talking about issues. We're always talking about what we need to do. It's kind of like Charlie Brown's teacher. But with the random drug testing for drivers, I had a parent and a student who was a junior last year. They worked primarily on the policy, and they presented it to the policy committee. They are much more open to when they see the community come together and say, this is what I think we need. Not just someone who always works in the field, but somebody who is living and day-to-day life. And so that was one thing that made that drug testing for student drivers possible, is because of the other people that were brought on board and that were the voice of the community.
And don't be afraid to ask Deacon or Nick or Epiphany for help, because there's a lot of times where Jenny and I communicate all the time, and we look at each other's policies and look to see if they would fit our community. But there's a lot of things that I have had access to because of Epiphany. And, sample marijuana legislation from across the nation, or sample synthetic bills. There's a lot of things that they are able to assist you with that gives you access to coalitions for information to bring back to your own community. So don't be afraid to reach out and ask how that needs to be done, and what some other places are doing and what might be the best fit for you, because they also know your community pretty well.
Yeah, I can just jump in there real quick if that's okay.
Yes.
So yeah, definitely please reach out to us if you have any questions, or if you have policies that you like to have shared, things like that. One of the things that we as ECS enjoy doing is, because we have so many clients in so many different areas, that we can kind of pull resources and capacity from across the nation, really help get those different policies that people are doing in different communities, in a variety of different types of communities as well. So please reach out to us. You always have Kelly and Deacon to go to, and all of the support staff as well. And the same goes for when you're looking and trying to figure out what type of data that needs to be collected. When you're saying, hey, this is the type of policy we want to pass, what is the data that will best tell that story and best make our argument? that's what we're here to do as well as your evaluation committee, or as your evaluation and as your evaluators. So please, ask those questions when we have our site visits with you and calls. And one of the other things that we'll talk about is we are building kind of a resource center for everyone through our member portal. And we'll talk about that a little bit more at the end. Go ahead.
All right, so I like the hamster. When Amy said, "Are you ready to talk about failed policies?" Yes, they have not gone through. They're not on the books. They're not being followed through with. But in regards to the failures of them, I've learned a lot. I've learned the pros and cons, what I need to do differently, and how do I need to approach things differently. So even though we were not successful in passing them, I learned a lot from them. So the couple that I have that were failures was the advocating for no smoking within 25 feet of employee entrances, and the smoke-free park goes together. That goes together with the trying to get people to get off the steps of the government, the courthouse steps. What I learned was we had tried to get all three of these together. We wanted the commissioners to look at them all because we felt as a coalition that these are very similar. That obviously if people coming in didn't have to walk through smoke, then we needed to respect the employees of the state buildings. And then we needed to provide our kids with a smoke-free park so that they didn't have to participate in the park and breathe in the secondhand smoke. However, during this 2 years we were trying to get that to happen, we were not able to pass the employee entrance because they felt that we have a couple commissioners that, one, does not feel that the secondhand smoking data is accurate. The CDC apparently doesn't know what they're doing, and secondhand smoke is not dangerous. So, we had to deal with that. That was the backlash there. And we also had another leader at that time that said that the rights of the employees were being stomped on. So those are a couple things that we had to go up against. We were not able to pass these two, but they allowed us to pass getting the tobacco off the steps. We're still in the process of the 20-foot guideline for the employee entrances. We haven't given up on that one. But the smoke-free park one, that one we learned pretty quickly that our community is not ready for that. The other communities around the area they've already had smoke-free park policies passed, and we utilized their policies and their examples, yet our community is just not ready for that. We have a very high adult smoking rate, very high tobacco rate among youth, and they do not see us smoking and tobacco and that harmful. They don't see it as a big deal. If they're just smoking, I'm glad they're just using tobacco instead of other substances. That's a lot of what we get. So even our community support is lacking on that. So the smoke-free park may not happen today, and our community may never be ready for that. But we're still working on the employee entrances. And the Alcopops. The Alcopops are the flavored alcohol beverages, the Smirnoff ices that are offered in gas stations. We were working with an organization out of Raleigh where we were trying to advocate to reassign the Alcopops, that they are not malt beverages. They have alcohol in them, and we thought that the Alcopops would be best in an ABC store, taken out of the gas stations, because they are also marketed for young girls. That's their target market. We learned a good lesson there as well, because that was not a concern of our community. That was something that our coalition, along with another coalition in the area, said, this is obvious. These should not be in the gas station. They are targeting our young girls. But our community did not see that as a concern. So they weren't really, they didn't see that as a big deal. So they weren't willing to really back that. That's an example of, you have to have community concern. It has to, the community has to be concerned or angry or want that to change, or else you're going to be beating your head against the wall. Amy?
You can see the very first one we have up there is the continuation of the mandatory 10-week class if they're caught, if middle school students or high school students are caught with tobacco. There was a program that we offered that had supplies that were provided through the state of West Virginia. We offered that anytime that the schools had a group of 3 or more that was caught with tobacco, and it was a 10-week behavior modification class that we taught. We had that thing going really, really well for probably 3 or 4 years. And then once we tried to have the school system implement that, that was not something that they were interested in. They wanted somebody to come in and teach it. And then with decreased funding of tobacco programs here in West Virginia, that program was eventually cut. So that was something that, was very helpful for the school system. They would require them to go through that 10-week behavior modification class. Instead of getting a ticket written, the probation school resource officer would not write them a ticket if they would go through that 10-week class. So now they are getting tickets written and they're having to go through the judicial system, unfortunately. Our coalition also tried to incentivize the random drug testing policy that our school board has for middle and high schoolers. And we were doing really, really well with that program. We were providing incentives for those students who passed their random drug test. And we had one parent who complained whose child got an incentive, saying that we were singling out the kids who did not pass, which is interesting to me because that was, unless a child came back into the classroom and said that they were drug tested, nobody knew why they were being pulled out of class. So that was very disheartening for us because we felt, and I had a very frank conversation with the superintendent of the school board, asking at what point do you allow positive peer pressure rule out over the negative peer pressure that's happening not only within the school system, but just within the community. We went very big our first year of our Drug-Free Communities grant, and we tried to put an outside counselor in the school system to help get kids to the point where they could tell a parent or a trusted adult that they need help for substance abuse. Because our school counselors, number one, they're not trained to do that type of work. And number two, they don't have the time. So those students who were really struggling in school that needed that extra counseling and needed that extra person to talk to, this counselor would have helped in that process and helped gotten them to a point where they felt comfortable to talk with an adult. And the lawyer for the State Board of Education did not feel like that was an option for any of the schools in West Virginia. And so it's ironic that now, 8 years later, our local mental health facility is now putting outside counselors in the school system for mental health counseling. So while it was a failed policy for us in the beginning, and we certainly can't take that win of having counselors put into the school system now, I'm happy to at least see that we started that process. I'm going to give us credit for starting that process and that it has moved forward. Another thing that we have failed completely on, and we have tried every year, is getting the state of West Virginia to require alcohol seller server training. At one time it was a requirement, and then the Alcohol Beverage Control Commission for the state of West Virginia no longer offered it. So the local coalitions have offered it, but it is up to your local community to put that into ordinance format to require that and make it mandatory. And unfortunately, our community will not do that. And so we have pushed on the state level to have that as a mandatory requirement again. And the ABCA is not willing to budge whatsoever. There you see the increase in alcohol taxes for the state. While it is a failed policy attempt, we keep trying every single year. We're like that little hamster running on that wheel and flying out every year, but we get right back in that wheel and we go back at it again with the same strength and determination that we started with the year before. And then the last thing that was a failed policy for us was on a state level, trying to mandate a fine with community service for underage drinking, because in our communities, we have so many magistrates that will only assign community service because the parent can't or the child can't afford to pay a fine. And so they will give them the option of community service. And we had long conversations with our magistrates, and they felt like they were seeing repeat people because they had no true investment into that consequence.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, yeah, you're doing community service, but that's like 12 hours out of your entire month,
Mm-hmm.
you know, depending on what your magistrate's going to assign for community service. And as a parent, you know, if it were my child, I'm not willing to pay that fine. So they're going to have to, my child is going to have to figure out how to come up with $175, $200 to work off that fine. So we felt like and we all know if you have some type of financial investment in something, you're a little bit more apt to maybe not do it again. So we've certainly had our fair share of policy attempts that have failed. But again, just like that little hamster, you got to get back in the wheel and you just got to keep going.
And one thing, as Amy was talking about, is that every time we have a failure, we have to reevaluate, okay, why did it fail? So in terms of like even her state and local alcohol seller server training, we actually in our community, just in a county over, they have, if the business fails a compliance check, so they sell to a minor, they now have a requirement that the business has to go through a seller server training program. So whereas maybe the state and local, you can't get it mandatory for every business, you can make it maybe specific as a consequence to where if they fail, this is what they have to do. So it's not affecting everybody. They don't see it as something that's large enough where they're mandating somebody who's not doing something wrong yet to be taking it, but that, hey, if you do this wrong, if this happens, if you sell to a minor, then this is a discipline, this is a consequence. So they're more apt to do something small like that, but still that makes a big difference. So you have to back up, reevaluate. No smoking within 25 feet of employee entrances, we have to step back and reevaluate, try something different. So every time we have a failure, reevaluate why. Why did I have that failure, and go after it again. If it's worth going after, I mean, if it's worth doing, it's worth going after again.
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's how we're going to sum up today is, you know, put your helmet on, go after that cheese over and over and over again, and be diligent and just never give up. At some point, one or more of the policies that you are looking at passing for the betterment of your community will happen. You just have to be patient. You got to have that helmet on to make sure that you don't get smushed in the process.
Yes, because sometimes, and don't take it personally. That's one thing I had to learn. Not everybody thinks like I do. Not everybody's smart as I am, you know? They're not as brilliant, and they can't see the future. But when you back up, eventually, again, gathering the right things, the community support, the data. I can't stress enough how the data, you cannot argue with data. That has been my saving grace numerous times in regards to policy or even consequences with students. That has been something that I just continue to fall back on. But never give up, like Amy said, reevaluate and go for it again, because your community's worth it. Your community is absolutely worth it. And if you talk with those individuals, like on one-on-one in private, they have the same concerns. They have absolutely the same concerns about their youth. So just go for it.